Internalizing Externalities. That's the title of this workshop. This is something that has been going on for quite a while. So basically, if you can price the externalities, you will solve the issue. And people might think of a cap and trade for carbon or stuff like that. But of course, it's predicated on the idea that you can put everything into a formula and that you can price everything. And now that's the engineer speaking. You cannot factor in limits by just pricing externalities. When there's limits, there's limits, and you can't go beyond. By the way, in the cap and trade, there's a cap, and the cap is the limit. Or you might say, okay, well, a limit is something that has an infinite price, but I'm not sure that this is the best way to go about that. So to discuss these issues, I will have two main speakers. So Anne Bucher, who is from the European Commission. Interestingly, Anne is until the end of this month, right, chair of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, which is a horizontal body in the European Commission that has basically to deal with impact assessments and the like. So she's very well placed, and she was before in DG ECFIN, the Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs. So she's very well placed to give a perspective from the side of the Commission, and we will have on the other side Stefan Speck, Project Manager, Environmental Economics and Policies at the European Environmental Agency. And again, he's a PhD in economics, just another economist in the room, specialized in environmental assessment. So these will be the two main presentations, and then we will have two discussions. Clive Spash from the Vienna University, Chair of Public Policy and Governance, and Denis Bouget, Senior Scientific Advisor to the European Social Observatory, which is, say, an NGO operating in Brussels for quite a while, commenting and proposing stuff on EU policy making. So, without further ado, Anne, the floor is yours, and then we will try to take as many questions as possible, of course, from the audience, questions, comments, etc. So, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having thought of the Regulatory Scrutiny Board to talk about this topic. I mean, I will give you a bit of flavour of what we see in the impact assessments of the Commission and the evaluations on the way the environmental and social effects are taken into account, and I mean, so how far you can go into this internalization of external costs. Just one word on the RSB as a reminder. I mean, we are board, the Commission has started scrutiny of impact assessment and evaluations a long time ago, in 2007, and in 2015 it's been decided to strengthen scrutiny by making the board a full-time job and by including external experts in the board. So we are 7, 3 of which are recruited from outside, and we're coming at the end of our 3-year mandate. Yeah? So basically I can talk on the basis of the more or less 180 impact assessment we have read and reviewed over the last 3 years. Another reminder might be useful for you on the impact assessment is that the principle in the Commission is that every important initiative which is likely to have significant impact is supposed to have an impact assessment. In practice, and I know it's also a complaint in this building, that there are many exceptions to this principle, so we do not see everything, but we see quite a lot. Also one important element, because this is a specific feature of the better regulation system in the EU compared to what exists at national level, is that it's not on regulatory and administrative burden or regulatory burden. I mean, the colleagues in the services, they expected to look at all impacts, economic, environmental, social, and also there are some specific impacts on the SMEs or fundamental rights which they need to look at. There's a bit of, I mean, you might be disappointed by the practice, and maybe now I come to explain you how you have to read this impact assessment and the kind of information you find in these impact assessments. First of all, I would make a distinction between the impact assessments on general policy, on policies like taxation, finance, judicial cooperation, migration, whatever, which have to also take into account the social and environmental impacts, and the specific environmental or social proposals for which the impact assessment approach has been developing over the years. Yeah? On the first one, so as I said, any proposal has to look at the three types of impacts. And as I said, you might be disappointed because the quantification of impacts in general is very, very challenging. And if you look at our statistics, you have basically a fourth of the impact assessment which have full quantification. You have a fourth which have no quantification, which are purely qualitative, and sometimes it's for good reasons, and sometimes it's for lack of data. And then in the middle, you have half of the impact assessment who are based on a best effort practice and have some form of quantification. And it's true that, in these impact assessment, if you look at them, I don't know, if you have something on reform of the VAT, you will have a lot of things on the compliance costs for SMEs. You will find very little on environment. They will, on social, it will tell you whether it will have an impact on employment. It will tell you whether it will have an impact on the consumer purchase power, but in fairly general terms. So that's the first disappointment you might have. For us, it's still very important that there's a real reflection on the direction of the bias, on the nature of the dynamic that the proposal might create. And generally, we have a complaint on the lack of quantification, and we push for this, but we know it has limits. Generally, what you can say, if you look at our impact assessment, and we have the statistics in our report, and I've left a couple of copies of our reports if you want to have an idea at the door there. 90% of the impact assessment look at the economic impact, 60% at the social impacts, and 40% at the environmental impacts. But as I said, in some cases, other dimensions are not always relevant. What I should say as well on these impacts, as I said, for us it's already important to identify in which direction the impact on the social issues and environment will be, and also to identify whether there are some trade-offs. And when there are some trade-offs, and when there are some choices to be made, it's very important for us in the RSB that this is fully documented. And I would take two examples recently, which you might have, and some of you might have seen. One was the CO2 standards for cars, where there were, we really asked for an in-depth review on the environmental and social aspect of this, because there were some tensions between the two. If you were pushing for electrical cars, you were affecting employment in the traditional car industry. And it's been a long debate, in the Parliament as well, on this issue. You have another example which I could quote where we asked for very detailed impact assessments, and we had several iterations with the services, which was on the CAP. For the Common Agricultural Policy, if you think of direct payments, there is a big demand for greening direct payments. But greening direct payments is really pushing for money going to the most advanced farmers. And if your Common Agricultural Policy is there to create a social safety net for the most vulnerable farmers, then there is a conflict in the policy. It's very hard to calibrate your policy. And so we've been asking how you use the different, first of all, the direct payments versus the rural development aid, and within the direct payments, how you define the parameters in order to both meet the social safety net aspect and use direct payments also to promote environmental objectives. So it's been a big discussion, and if you go in the impact assessment, I really invite you to look at the impact assessment for the CAP, because there's a whole discussion around these issues with very, very detailed discussion on the parameters. So that's one, two examples, I would say, of areas where, how policies which were directed to general objectives like the CAP or the other ones on climate change have been looking in details into the employment and social aspect. More precisely, on the other types of proposals, which are more the environmental and the social proposals. So these are areas which we in the board, and we will come soon with the kind of overall lessons learned from our experience of 3 years of impact assessment. These are areas where we consider that the efforts to quantify and to integrate, to look at the comprehensive views on all the different impacts are very advanced. And I think one of the reasons is because of the difficulties in the areas, because the benefits are long-term and the costs are immediate, and because you have, those who benefit are not systematically those who pay, the problem of the principal agent. And therefore, in these areas, the services of the Commission have very early developed methods to be able to show the benefits of such policy, even if they have some cost in the short term. And I would say, that most of the in most of the cases, what they apply is a cost-benefit analysis, and what they do is they do it on very long terms, over 1 or 3 decades. And I could give you some examples which we had recently. For instance, in the social area, we had the discussion on the parental leave and maternity leave. It was based on very, very comprehensive calculations of the cost of making parentally, for instance, paternity leave compulsory for 2 weeks. I think it cost, their actual cost was 20 euros at the end of a three decades period, and trying to formalize in the model all the benefits of having parental leave, leave for care, or maternity leave. And this was done through a number of aspects of reduction of quantifying the reduction in absenteeism at work. It was done also by quantifying the effects which we have seen on the participation of women on the labour market and so on. And this is a very, very detailed impact assessment, and I invite you to look at it. Another area where a lot of effort has been done for this in the social area, where a lot of effort has been done in the Commission, was the whole body of legislation on the protection of workers from carcinogens and mutagens. And for this, again, we have developed with the services a methodology to allow to calculate the cost, substance per substance, of reducing exposure for the workers, depending on whether they are, how big is the companies, active in the field, existing or not of substitution material and all this, and calculating also the benefits in terms of reduction of illness and reductions of health cost, and reduction in the number of lives. So these methodologies have been developed for files which are very, very difficult afterwards in co-decision. And I mentioned this one on carcinogens and mutagens because it's one where, if you look at the speed right now in co-decision, it's been particularly fast. Now we have this stable methodology which we have applied to several batches of substances, and it has gone through. On the environment, the one where I would say we consider best practice, although it's also contested by various stakeholders, is the one on the climate change, on the 2020 and 2030 package. Because, why do we consider it a best practice? Because it's been it's an effort which is, first of all, there was a comprehensive reference scenario up to 2050, which has been built and validated by the member states, which was really saying what will happen, what are the kind of innovation we're going to have, and what it will imply in a number of areas, employment, environment, CO2 emissions, and so on. And on that basis, they have used a suite of models, with a model, first model which was looking at evaluating the costs and the benefits of various targets for CO2 emissions, depending how you combine it with other targets for renewables or energy efficiency, and looking at, depending on how your policy will affect more sectors like transport, agriculture versus power sector or others. So there has been very, very detailed work which has been done around this and taking really a comprehensive view. And what was very good is that this framework afterwards was used to calibrate the individual proposals on the energy efficiency of building and things like that. It's a fairly technical work, so before complaining about the work, I think you have to invest a lot to understand how it's been done, but we consider that it's one of the cases where the efforts of looking at sensitivity analysis and having a coherent approach across proposals was very strong. And if you speak to our colleagues in the Commission dealing with all the climate change issues, I mean, they're very firm saying that if we hadn't tools like this, an impact assessment which were really showing cost and benefits and the sensitivity analysis, we would never have been able to sell the policy in the Council. So I leave you with that.
Thank you. Before I pass on, I'll use the Munchausen method and ask you just one question, because when I listen to you, I still have the impression that it boils down to monetizing impact. Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I was especially struck by what you said about carcinogens and mutagens and the reasoning in terms of lost work days or increased social security expenditures. Because I might say, well, let me bring it to the absurd. Let's scrap social security. So even when people are sick, we don't need to pay. So the economic cost is zero. And let's assume that we have an ample workforce and that we can dismiss people at will. So you fall ill, I fire you because I get an ample supply of replacement. In that case, the cost is also zero, except that maybe there's a transition because I need to fire someone and have someone instead to only have healthy people. And I'm using this absurdity basically to express the fact that we may actually want people not to be sick, not because sickness has a cost, because we don't want people to be sick, because we want people to live a good life. And money has nothing to do with that. It is a policy objective to avoid people being affected by cancer or by the effect of mutagens on them. So, and it has nothing to do with cost. So to me, the very idea of quantifying and say, because, well, ultimately you might say, okay, well, there's a cost, and, well, we can afford that cost, and so let's do it for the sake of employment or corporate profits. And this is really a kind of reasoning that I can't follow. So, but maybe I misunderstood you.
You want me to
Yeah,
answer?
yeah.
Okay. I mean, we do not monetize everything. I mean, if you look at the impact assessment, exactly, we leave the choice. I think the impact assessment is there to inform a policy choice. So it is not saying the cost-benefit is like this and then you should go for this direction. The cost-benefit tells you how many lives you have saved. And for instance, on the carcinogens and mutagens, we do not monetize human life, but we tell how many lives have been saved, to what extent you increase the life expectancy of workers, and this is not monetized. You also put the benefits in terms of saving on health expenditure, because this is important. I mean, you might, I know you pushed your case to the extreme by saying you can always replace a worker. If you talk to companies, it's not like this. There's a cost in recruiting workers. But, I mean, if you go to the impact assessment, and I think it's really something where precisely taking a long-term perspective matters, is that you show that even if you do not quantify all the benefits, just by quantifying health saving and things like that, you still have a positive cost benefit at the end of the day. Yeah? And so that's very, convincing for the policy. You give all the benefits, you describe them, and you show that just on the part of these benefits, if they can be monetized, that gives you a profit for society as a whole. And that's important when you come and defend the policy.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to Stefan Speck. I think you have a formal presentation, I think. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and for the invitation to this conference and also here to speak on the session of Internalizing Externalities. I was asked to present here the views of the EEA on externalities, and then also to think about this a little bit further, to think what can be improved and maybe what's going wrong. And in this context, I want to mention is what we heard already earlier in the session of modeling. What I present here in the first part is certainly the views of the EEA there, and in the second part is probably more my own views there.
Fair enough.
So, but when we are looking about internalization of externalities, there we can achieve this with very policy measures, and certainly the most interesting and what I will speak mostly is about market-based instruments like charges, taxes, but we have also regulatory instruments and voluntary instruments. Can I get next? And but before I want to go into it, maybe to bring this more into the policy context. It's the polluter pays principle is a view of internalizing externalities. This we heard already this morning. And the polluter pays principle is an important basis of international law and is also enshrined in the European community and in particular in the Article 191 in the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. And here, but the beginning of the polluter pays principle was established in 1972. It must be quite an important year when we are thinking also with the limits to growth of the Club of Rome there. That OECD published there this guidance document where it's written the polluter should bear the expenses of carrying out measures to ensure that the environment is in an acceptable state. And the whole idea about the polluter pays principle was also again mentioned in Principle 16 of Rio 1992. Now, next slide, please. Now I want to go what the EEA, what the European Environment Agency is doing this. I want to focus there on my presentations or my short intervention about two reports there, what was published in the last 4 or 5 years there. The first is the cost of air pollution from European industrial facilities. There was the idea to assess the damage costs to health and the environment caused by pollutant emission from industrial facilities. The approach which was employed there is to estimate damage costs, which was based on existing standard policy tools and methods. In order to account for the external cost of air pollution, adverse impacts on human health and the environment are expressed in a common metric or monetary value. And these monetary values have been developed in cooperation with different scientific and also the economic discipline. This is what we have heard earlier, that economists or modeling should go broader. This was certainly done in this whole approach about how to estimating damage costs there. But what we have to keep in mind is damage costs incorporate a certain degree of uncertainty. And the report states that, however, when considered alongside other sources of innovation, damage costs can support decisions by drawing attention to the implicit trade-offs inherent in decision-making. For example, in cost-benefit analysis used to inform legislative impact assessments, what we heard at the moment there. The other study, what was published by the EEA, was the road user charge for heavy good vehicles. There was the idea was, or the approach was to estimate the external cost of air pollution for different categories of heavy good vehicles. And this was part of the whole discussion about the Eurovignette directive, which was then implemented in or proposed in October 2010. Next slide. Here, there I show some. Sorry, but it's very small there. I hope you can see it a bit better there. Okay, this was some estimates of the damage costs of this first report of the air pollution. What I want to highlight in particular, we have there two columns which are based on two different approaches, methods. And this was measured or estimated the damage cost for some pollutants like NH3, NOx, SO2, And with the two different methodologies, what you have, you get quite big differences in the damage costs. The next. This was in this report, and when I'm looking now in the other report, what was done in the calculations of the internalizing of external costs by HGV there. Could we get? Here it was calculated. Is it possible to make it big a bit? Yeah. Here was calculated now all the air pollution costs in euro per ton of road transport based on the same approach, but for each individual European country. And in the other case, there was calculated only the damage costs for the EU on average there. Therefore, there is already quite a high degree of uncertainty between these both approaches. And also how you are doing this, what methodology you are using. Next slide. And therefore, when we are thinking about conceptual challenges, it's certainly that there are some problems in the analytical methods and data shortcomings. This makes the estimation of external costs and the degree of internalization quite uncertain. The other issue is the external costs are valid only with regard to the specific cases for which we are calculating. The challenge is then also what we see in many studies is that you have the benefit transfers, that you are using the costs or the external costs what you're calculating from one study to the other. There is certainly also a high degree of uncertainty and how to scale them up. Another aspect is certainly that in this whole approach there, how you're calculating is there is no consideration of critical natural capital and tipping points. Say the whole idea about planetary boundaries is probably not covered fully. The other issue is about how far can we go with quantifying external costs. There are studies or, for example, issues like pain and suffering. These are intangible, non-tangible social costs. Can we find their value for this? Or then, when we don't find a value, we can't use it in the whole approach there. And the whole discussion in the context of damage costs is certainly the idea about the longer-term issues. And there, I think, probably we'll come later in the whole discussion about what is the discount rate in this whole issue. But when we are looking now more about some more practical issues, it's in our taxation and internalizing externalities. Here I have a quote of the High-Level Commission on Carbon Pricing, where it's clearly stated that well-designed carbon price is an indispensable part of a strategy for reducing emissions in an efficient way. Now the question is, what is a well-designed carbon price? When we are looking there more about what was said, probably the orthodox way of economics, is that economic theory states that for having a cost-effective, efficient carbon taxation schemes, all sources should be taxed at the same tax rate, and would be set equal to the marginal benefits of emission reduction, represented by the estimates of the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon is the issue about the long-term damage done by a ton of CO2 emission in a given year. On the other hand, the social cost of carbon is also interpreted as represents the value of damages avoided for a small emission reduction as a benefit of a CO2 reduction. But this approach of setting or calculating social cost of carbon is going back to Bouget 1920 and is more or less under the heading of corrective taxes. But a more pragmatic approach, in my opinion, is the standard price approach, where you set the tax rate and it can be increased with the aim of achieving predetermined political reduction target. This goes back to Baumol and Oates, and probably the best example is the Swiss CO2 levy, please, which was introduced in 2008 and is a levy on thermal fuels. The levy rate was increased in 4 stages by a factor of 8 from 12 tons of Swiss francs per CO2 to 96 tons, the current amount. And it was always increased because the interim target for fossil thermal fuels set by the government, Swiss government, had not been reached. So there was an automatical increase of the tax rate when we don't achieve a given reduction target. So that you are combining quantity with value, with a tax rate, with policy price. There was done this year some impact assessments, and this was done also with a bottom-up and a top-down modeling approaches. And it was not done in the context of internalizing externalities. It was more thought about what is the results there. And the results was, what the research brought up, the CO2 levy has led to noticeable emission reduction. And it was also showed a greater impact than any other instrument. So when we are thinking now how to set carbon price in corrective taxes or standard price approach, there was published last year a report by some scholars from the IMF, Energy Price Reform, a Guide for Policymakers. They are writing then as regards value of carbon damages. The standard approach in economics literature would be the use of social cost of carbon. This is the approach what we would almost imagine what you see in IMF reports. But then in the context of Paris Agreement, they write that countries may instead prefer to use CO2 values in line with their mitigation pledges. That you are really to think about is setting the rate to achieve your mitigation pledges, your reduction targets. Briefly coming to my last slide, this is more the social cost of carbon is also often used in policy appraisals and evaluations, in particular in cost-benefit analysis. And here it's a figure what I used from a report by the working paper by the OECD, which showed the wide range of carbon values used in CBAs of investment projects in the transport sector in many European countries. And there you can see there's quite big differences at that time in 2014 when the report was published. First between the countries, but also, thank God, also in the time period of when it was used there. And I hope I gave you a bit of presentation what the EA is doing, but also some more forward-looking thinking about do we need really always to calculate or to monitorize the externalities, because we have in so many environmental areas dimensions, quantifiable targets, which you have to achieve sooner or later, and there to use more this standard price approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, you've puzzled me even more, so I will ask you basically the same question I asked to Anne, because I still don't get it. I may be a bit stupid, but when you say, well, first, say polluters pays principle, well, we have to make sure that they carry the cost of restoring the environment to an acceptable state. But what is acceptable? Can you define this? I mean, acceptable is something that is a decision by society. What kind of damage? Do we want heavy metals in our soil? How much of them? Maybe we don't want any of them. And so, I mean, this is quite fuzzy as a concept. And then I really wonder how you compute cost to the environment, because I might, and that is again the engineer speaking, I might think, okay, you pollute the environment and the cost would be the cost of restoring the environment to its pristine status. And that is something I can understand. But when it is physically impossible to restore the environment to its pristine state, then the cost is infinite, yes. Right? So that blows your methodology. I don't think, and again, you mentioned it very well. You cannot factor in tipping points. Back to climate. So there's a point beyond which the quantity of CO2 in the atmosphere results in making this planet unlivable for human beings. There's a level, whatever the level is, but there is one level. So beyond that tipping point, there's no human beings. So the cost to humanity is again infinite. So it's not that you can say, okay, I can put a price on a ton of CO2 because if there's a price and if you can buy that ton of CO2, you can at a point reach, you can reach a point where so many tons of CO2 have been bought that you make life impossible on this planet. So again, I still don't get it. How you can basically put a price on nature. So cap and trade, I understand. Or you can say, okay, we politically decide that we want to reduce by so much by that date and we want to be carbon neutral in 2050. And then you decide, as you said, to put a price on carbon that will get you there. This I understand. But putting price on pollution, for instance, by heavy metals in the soil, I'm afraid to say that in my view, and again, that's what I wanted to say from the outset, the notion of limit of things where you say, well, I don't want to go beyond this limit. You cannot factor that in with a price. To me, it's the tool that you need as an instrument then is a law that forbids stuff. Yeah. You cannot kill me. This is illegal. Of course, you will pay a price if you do it. But law says this is a no-go area. It is not, if you pay that price, you can kill me. And to me, it's a bit the same idea. So if you can just explain to me, because maybe I didn't get it.
Oh, challenge. Okay, say acceptable state, your first issue. I completely agree with you, but we have to think about this, that we have a political acceptable state, that we said we want to reduce by 95% emission reduction. And this is now a goal or an instrument to achieve the goal, to achieve this reduction target. So it's nothing about limits and so on. I think this was my comment, that the whole internalization debate, it's, for me, difficult or a complex issue where you can't go, where you can go only or you can't go normatively. You have to think about this, that you have there a state, what was agreed, politically agreed, and you want to achieve this. And other areas where it's going to health issues, then it's certainly internalization, or what I said earlier, that market-based instrument is one policy instrument for achieving internalization. But there is then also regulatory, there you have to ban there then. There is then clearly that for these issues, what I showed you, these figures for mercury and so on, you have had huge external cost. It's not, in my opinion, it doesn't make sense there to calculate this.
Okay, I agree with you. Okay.
It's more than to think really that this must be banned. Hotspots must be banned there. Okay. I wanted to present only what was done.
Okay, now I get it. Thank you. But so you recognize that there may be a need to ban stuff and not just to price it. Yeah. So, thank you very much. So, Clive Spash from the Vienna University. So, first, you get a chance to react to what was said and add in a few original comments of your own.
Okay, so it seems to me that there's quite a bit of confusion here in the conversation about quite a lot of different things. I would say, what do we mean by value? What do we mean by the use of prices? What do we mean when we're talking about political regulation of the environment versus the economist's approach? And this whole session is talked about internalizing externalities, right? Well, that model of internalizing externalities based around the idea that there is a market system that is absolutely perfect and allocates resources efficiently. And that is bullshit. It doesn't exist, right? Now, the point here is that the perfectly functioning market model, right, means, and under Pigou, it's a minor aberration on the system. Pollution is some small thing. It's the factory which is putting some dirt onto the laundry next door. I mean, these are the kinds of arguments you get in codes and in the literature that's in this area. It's not climate change. It's not the pervasive pollution that we have in our society today. Everything that goes through our economy goes back into the environment. I mean, materials and energy. Nothing is created or destroyed. It's transformed and it goes back. That means there isn't an externality. It's not external to the system. It's part of the system. If you have a growth economy, you are going to grow the environmental impacts continuously. They get bigger and bigger every year because we have a material economy. And this is what you see with carbon. Carbon is increasing year on year because we have a fossil fuel-based economy and we have a growth economy. And we have no other type of economy has ever existed as an industrial economy. It's the only economy we ever had, a fossil fuel-based economy. So it's not external. It's part of the system. So then you get the economists coming along and saying, oh, we're going to come up with optimal pricing where we're going to internalize these externalities, which aren't external in the first place. And we're going to make them optimal, which means that you're going to have an optimal number of dead people, an optimal number of people with cancers, an optimal number of heavy metals in rivers, an optimal number of dead fish in extinct species, and so on. And there are books with things like optimal extinction in the environmental economics literature, you know. And why, right? Because it's not about, I'm going to kill you as a person, I'm just going to kill people in general. Right? It's a fundamental issue in the way in which values are being thought about here. So what do we mean there? So when you start discussing values in this context, so there's an example. I'll give you an example. Zaza Gabor was asked what her greatest achievement was in her life. And Zaza Gabor said, I've learned how to keep my husband always healthy and young. And the journalist says, how do you do that? I replace him every 5 years. Right? Now, what does that mean, okay? What it means is, one, that Zaza Gabor has no relationship to her husband as a specific person, right? And she's prepared. But this is what we're getting with valuation. There's no relationship here to specific people. And the same you get in ecosystem services valuation, you get it across the board. There is no relationship to a specific place. There's no sense of place. There's no relationship to species. So if I look at the conservation literature today, what the conservationists are doing, like Peter Kariva and other people who are Mark Tarek and people who are running very large NGOs in the States and who are allying with corporations, what they're doing is they're doing exactly the Zaza Gabor mistake. They're talking about we can afford to remove species, we can lose species, because there's no change in the functioning of the ecosystems. Things don't matter, right? I can replace one species with another species. We can trade things off. And of course, this word trade-off is key to both of your speeches, right? It comes through in the impact assessment. The important thing is how we trade things off, and it comes through in the cost-benefit approach. And this is the idea, trading things off, that things can be traded off. And that leads you to another fundamental concept in philosophy and values, which is commensuration. What do we mean by commensuration? We mean making things equivalent. So what do you make equivalent? Well, if you take a monetary value of things, you make everything equivalent. It's all the same, right? It costs 10 euros to do this, it costs 10 euros to do that, whatever it is. So it's very interesting that things like value of life are excluded sometimes. Why? If you've gone down the route of monetization, you should go all the way. Or, if you're not doing that, then why are you not doing it? Because what you're implying to me is that you've brought in a second criteria now. A criteria that says some things should not be valued in monetary terms. Well, very good then. And on what basis do you make that? What's your philosophical approach for making this decision? So then we get to the point that you have different value systems, and there are fundamentally 3 different value systems in philosophy, right? Yeah, don't turn away and look funny. It's, basically what you're doing is consequentialism. You have a fundamental consequentialist philosophy. It's Bentham-ite utilitarianism. And that's why it fits so nicely into economics, because economists have based their entire theory on a very particular ethics. They go around pretending they have no ethical theory. They do have an ethical theory. It's a very, very specific ethical theory. It's called preference utilitarianism. That means that everything in their models is valued on the basis of the preferences of individuals. And if individuals do not have a preference about it, it does not get valued. It's as simple as that. And how do they get these values? They go out there and they do surveys and they ask people what the value of things are, or they impute them through existing markets. And if there's no market, you can't impute it. So they have a real problem with the way they're going about it. This is a consequentialist philosophy. It's one of 3 major Western philosophies. The other 2 are that you've got deontology, rights-based thinking, which is Kantian. So you do the right thing. It's wrong to kill people. It's wrong to make species extinct. Right? It's another way, and we enshrine this in our legal system. It exists in our legal system. We have laws specifically to actually follow this kind of approach. And we can say it's wrong to value people's lives in monetary terms, right? So this would be a category. And then there's the virtue ethics. Well, this morning, these things were being conflated again by our honourable speakers. So you get things like equating flourishing to development, to growth, to well-being. This is a conflation of different values. Well-being is not the same as flourishing. Flourishing is a concept that goes back to Aristotle. It's about virtues. It's about how you live a meaningful life. It's about a good life. And it's a totally different way of approaching values and the philosophy of living. So this is the problem. So what do we get in policy, in public policy, from the agencies, from the European Commission? We get an extremely narrow economic approach, which is pushing a very particular type of consequentialist thinking, and it's highly problematic. So just to finish for now a comment. Okay, so think about the economic system. Prices. Even if you were to use the cost as opposed to the benefit side of the equation. So you say, well, I think that we could work out what the cost of repairing an ecosystem would be, or something like this. What does that value represent? What does the cost represent? If you take the economic logic, you should have internalized all the externalities for that cost to actually have any meaning in terms of resource allocation. If you realize that you cannot internalize all the externalities, then you don't have a price reflecting an efficient resource allocation. And let's just take one example. Let's take climate change. So we're going to internalize all the costs of climate change so that we can have an efficient carbon price. It's been admitted this is already problematic, right? Everybody in this room has got carbon in their body. Are we going to put this into the equation? Everything that actually is part of the carbon system would have to be part of the system. Everything in this room that has got carbon embodied in it would have to be part of the system, right? Every single price in the economy would have to change. And who would set this price? The economists? Who? What? But if you don't set the price, you've already made a decision that affects the prices you have in the economy. So the prices we have in the economy are not, as economists tell us, mainstream economists tell us, they are not efficient prices. They are prices that are set by decisions that we make about what we want to include and exclude from the market system, about power relationships in society, the institutions we have. And it was very interesting in the previous session on modeling, at one point it was said that if you look at the way corporations operate, in the trade relationships, you have real problems with knowing how to price things, because they change the prices that they decide on what they're going to import and export, depending on the tax rates in different countries. They shift the prices around, right? So the prices are arbitrary, and they're subject to regulation. They're subject to the type of economy you have, and so on, right? So there is no efficient price. There is no cost price. So what we come back to is that the entire argument from mainstream economics is bullshit.
I can sympathize with many things you said, but I remember saying this morning that, every argument we make should be founded in reality, and there's a lot of reality in what you say. But what I would try to avoid doing is basically saying the economists, because I know many economists, and, I have not a one-size-fits-all economist. There's a more numerous kind than others, yet they are all individuals and they do not all think the same. But I agree with you that indeed this pricing thing is problematic. By the way, I worked for a big multinational for 22 years, and I can tell you that you're perfectly spot on in saying that prices are arbitrary, and especially when it comes to software. It was whatever price we could extract from the client. Mm-hmm. That was a rule. Yeah. And for the rest, anything went. So there you have a point.
For the record, I'm an economist as well.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I will defend the Commission and the agencies, because it's not the Commission and the agencies, because at the end, those who make political decisions are us. When I say us, it's Parliament and Council, the people who have been elected. And so I can indeed not agree with the way the Commission does impact assessment, etc. But in each and every case, the final decision, and it can be on basic legislation, It can be on what we call delegated acts, which are the complex ways in which we implement legislation. At the end of the day, the decision is always taken by people who have political responsibilities, either directly elected, like us in the parliament, or accountable to a directly elected parliament in the member state. So if you want to blame, then direct your blame where it belongs. And I would say it's Parliament and Council, basically politicians. This is where the blame should be addressed. So I really insist on that, because it's too easy, and especially for politicians, to escape the blame by hiding behind, these unelected Brussels bureaucrats. I know many of these unelected Brussels bureaucrats, they work for us. They work for us. We are the ones responsible. We should not shy away from that. And then we may like or dislike political decisions that are being taken, but then again, these political decisions have a majority in Parliament and Council. So allocate the blame where it belongs. And that's really important, because, again, if we believe in democracy, we should not try to shift the blame to people who are paid to serve the democratic institutions, and that is the civil servants, for whom I have a lot of respect, even when I disagree, because, they are human beings and they have opinions as well. So it's not that they are, or should I say, totally devoid of, they are human beings like any of us. That was more of a remark. Final contribution to Denis Bouget from the European Trade Union Institute and European Social Observatory. I think that we are going to speak more about the social aspect than the environmental one. Am I mistaken?
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you also for your last words, because very often when I speak about the EU institutions, all the criticism are going against the European Commission more than European Parliament, the political parties in Parliament. It's not a socialist Parliament, or the Council. And very often I say that no, it's not the responsibility of the European Commission. It's the responsibility of the Council, for instance. It's a decision of the Council, not a decision of the European Commission. But at the same time, very often, very few people know the difference between the European Commission and the Council, except us, of course. Okay, so now I am in a very, very strong position, because I have to give you some criticism against or about the impact assessment, which is under the responsibility of the European Commission. Okay, so I will continue after the first speech about the impact assessment in social domain. Okay, I will speak about 3 points. The first point is about the definition of the impact assessment in the EC documents. The first point. The second point will be about the rationale of the methodologies of impact assessment at the European Commission. And the third point will be some comments, especially about the rationale. About the definition, next slide. Okay. I prefer to take directly the definitions in the European Commission documents, and it's not my interpretation, it's not something like I have written, no. It's the impact assessment. You have two couple of words. The first couple is policy objectives on legislation. It's about the content of the impact assessment. And the second couple is more a methodological couple about evidence on methodology, integrated approach of impact assessment. So you have four important words, and coming from two EC documents, the toolbox on the guidelines. The toolbox is a very big textbook of more than 400 pages, in which you have a lot of details about the process of impact assessment. And it's really a very coherent textbook, very coherent, whatever the chapters. Second point, second quality. It takes on innovation in different methodologies. And also, it obeys more or less the aim of the EU institution. And finally, it's a very useful instrument for reviewing the EU acquis. And it's not my main purpose, but I want to start by what is the impact assessment in the methodologies of the European Commission. And the second point is about the rationale of, or the foundation of the impact assessment. And next slide. Okay. In tool 11, you have a question: how to analyze problems. And the answer in the book is a public policy intervention may be justified when there is market failures, when there is a regulatory failure, when you have a problem of inequality, and when you have behavior biases. Okay. And when I read these paragraphs, sincerely, I fell off my chair. Because whatever the justification, you have always the image, the picture of a competitive market. You can read, you have time to read the different sentences. The first one, of course, you have the reference to efficiency with, into bracket, the optimum of Pareto, the Parisian optimality. The second one is linked to law, more or less to law, the failure in law, but the example is the divergence from the efficient market. On the third one, I will come back about the third one, which is very strange for me. And the last one is about the behavior bias, when you don't try to obey your self-interest. Sincerely, my comments are about the societal consequences of this type of picture of the intervention in the public policy, and also in social domains. It will be the last point, and you can continue next. It's only okay. Before to criticize the previous text, I want to mention that I don't say anything about the technical improvement in the impact assessment. And there are a lot of improvement, for instance, about the consultation of citizens in the EU, for instance. There are a lot of improvement. I don't say anything about it. I don't say anything about the epistemics of the theories of evaluation, about, for instance, about the difference between the objectivist approach versus the constructivist approach. It's another domain. I want to focus my comments about the previous text. Why? Because the previous text gives an image of society which is only an economic world with a competitive market. And the competitive market is the best solution in society. Why? Because you can reach a Parisian optimality. The consequence is that you turn some microeconomics model, or I prefer theory, into a kind of rule in society. You must be competitive if you want to obtain, in Pareto, it's called la colline du plaisir, because it was in French, the hill of pleasure. Okay? It's the best solution not only for individuals, but it's the best solution for the society. At the same time, what is the consequence? The consequence of this shift, which is very normative, it creates a kind of quasi-monotheistic religion, because you have to believe to this kind of value if you want to be very happy. The consequence is that, for instance, you don't take into account the problems or the experience of reality. You don't take into account, for instance, history. You don't take into account several aspects of sociology or anthropology. For instance, in the previous session, there was a list of different disciplines with economics, psychology, and so on and so on and so on. I have seen there were two lacks. The first one was about sociology. Sociology was not quoted. The second one was about legislation, about law. So the first point is that you have a society which is only a kind of global market. Second point, about the state, about the public authorities. The public authorities are reduced to become a kind of partner, negotiating with enterprises or citizen movement and so on and so on. Or a kind of umbrella organization of agencies. So you reduce the power of the state, not only the real power, but the value of the power of the state or the public authorities. Linked to the state, you have the problem of law. Law is becoming self-regulation. It's better, it's more efficient to negotiate between private entities new rules. Self-regulation, recommendations, and more general, what we say, the soft law. The soft law is always more efficient than the hard law. Third, about the state on the law. Evidence, which have to be very concrete in the documents. The evidence is completely biased because the precision of the data doesn't say anything about the value which has been the basis on which you have built the statistics, the data. And there were a lot of very, very good comments about the problem of the statistical problem. I don't insist about this problem. I would like to insist about the problem of the citizens, because in the toolbox, for instance, citizens are very, very often quoted. But if we consider that citizens are citizens of a state, citizens of a country, in this kind of ideology, citizens are reduced to become a consumer, rational consumer, of course, but they are reduced to be consumers. And I would like also to insist about the third point. Could you come back to the previous, about inequality or equity? Sincerely, I have read several times the sentence, and I don't very well understand why there is a link between efficiency and equity. And the sentence gives a very negative opinion of equity. And it suggests that equity is totally different. It's totally impossible to have at the same time efficiency and equity. But in the history shows exactly the contrary. It's possible to have at the same time efficient policies and also equitable or policies with some equity. Now about the consequences in the social domains. When we look at the externalities in general, social externalities from a competitive market are mainly poverty, because you have not a minimum wage. You have not any concern about sickness at work or injuries at work. And I consider that the competitive market has produced in history a lot on huge social externalities. On how in history this kind of social externalities have been compensated or decreased. It's mainly by the building of social welfare systems and also the labor regulations. And what we see today, in the name of modernization of social welfare systems, modernization of the labor regulation, we see a systematic decline of the social welfare systems in the most developed countries in Europe. And so we obtain more or less the contrary of the ideology of the neoliberalism. And now, to conclude, I would like to conclude on 3 points. The first one is about the impact assessment methodologies. The impact assessment methodologies, especially in social domains, and I totally agree with you, they have to go beyond the market. When we look at the chapter on human rights, for instance, or the chapter or the tool in the toolbox, the tool on human rights, or the tool on the social protection, and it's very clear that the text is more cautious about the different consequences of a public decision, for instance. And so it's very interesting to see that the impact assessment somewhere stops in front of the door of human rights, especially the absolute human rights, but also sometimes in front of some doors, for instance, the Article 155 of TFEU about the decision between the social partners. If there is a decision between social partners, in this case, the use of impact assessment has to be more or less stopped. It's a little more complicated, but there is something like this. But at the same time, we can say, yes, we go to beyond the market, but we don't know exactly what will be the doctrine on which we build this kind of assessment beside the impact assessment built on the competition on the competitive market. Second point, I always, in all the conference, I remind from the ILO Declaration of Philadelphia, labor is not a commodity, always. If you consider a labor as a commodity, I remember, because I taught microeconomics, not only a commodity, but sometimes in some mathematical models you have the labor is a negative consumption. Wow. Okay, so labor is not a commodity. On the third point, because I discussed only on social points, we note today a kind of convergence between the social concerns and the ecological concerns. And it's really new, because for many decades there were ecological concerns with a lot of books on ecology, but without the social dimension of the ecological concerns. And in the social domain, not any interest about the ecological concerns. And today, even the academic milieu, we see more and more convergence between both. And not only from an intellectual point of view, but I can give you an example, for instance, about the social investment, which was the social investment package at the beginning of the previous, these decades, and at the DG employment, and we see at the same time the idea of some kinds of ecological investment, and they are very linked together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We're doing well in terms of time. I will first give the floor back to Anne Bucher and Stefan Speck. If I can summarize my way of understanding the criticisms that have been expressed by both Clive Spash and Denis Bouget, it would seem to me that what is questioned is the underlying value system that in which, in a way, internalizing the cost or impact assessments is nested. Explicitly, the criticism is about economicism, basically reducing everything to the economic dimension, and that was what I meant also when I spoke about monetizing everything. And can I have again the slide that Denis was just using, with the four elements of the impact assessment?
The definition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The one before that? The one where there was equity. Yeah, voilà, that one.
Yeah.
Because to me, the operative word here is efficiency. What is the definition of efficiency? If, of course, one defines efficiency in terms of maximizing monetary outcome, and that is GDP, then, of course, it's a reductive way of defining efficiency. And the last word before I give you back the word, sometimes, and again, it's the engineer speaking, and I minored in economy, but I have the impression that the dominant paradigm of the economist would be maximization, whereas the dominant paradigm of the engineer would be optimizing under constraint. Mm-hmm. The constraint defining a box within which one has to operate. And the constraints may be social, may be environmental, may be whatever. Thou shalt not kill. This is a constraint. And we have to operate within that constraint. And these are indeed more ethical choices. So can you react to that and see where you agree or disagree with the way the démarche that you are having is painted? Anne, maybe first?
I think I could fully agree with what you say last, that it is optimizing under a certain number of considerations and constraints. I mean, I think Pareto is not a market representation. Pareto optimum is a technique. It's basically to define exactly that, an optimum under constraints, and the constraints or whatever. So I think Pareto would really get out of his grave if he knew how you present him. And I think you have to go back to basics on this. I mean, that's very different. So I'm a bit at a loss because I think there's a misunderstanding on the intention. I mean, one thing is to represent what is the ideal society and the ideal policy, and how you define it, and how you structure your values and your objectives, and how you build your policy. Another thing is what we're doing when we do EU policies. Because the values are not defined in the better regulation textbook. The values are in the treaty.
Yeah.
So there has been, what we do with the better regulation is we are operationalizing, to operationalize the decision of a political agenda which is set in the treaty and which is set in the mandate we get from the Parliament and the Council. So there's a whole system to define the values which goes from what is in the treaty then what are the main priorities of the Commission, how this is, so what the better regulation helps you to optimize the policy, but the policy and the system, the values hierarchy is not coming from the Commission. So, I mean, it goes back to also what you said. I want to be very concrete. You're talking of equity. Equity is not an EU policy, but it's not. It's not in the treaty.
Article 2 of the treaty.
I mean, it's not a policy on which we have instruments. So, I mean, what you have...
This I would question.
I mean, then go back to the articles. What you need to do...
I partly agree with you.
You agree?
Partly.
Then what we have to do is take into considerations equity when we design our policies. And that's why we look at this aspect in our policies. But I think it has to be very clear what are our, and you're talking of the market. The market is defined in the treaty. Competitive markets are defined in the treaty. Single markets obligations are defined in the treaty. Yeah? And then we have, in the impact assessment, to respect subsidiarity. The tools we have to deal with. I mean, you were talking of social welfare system. We have no tools for social welfare system. We have coordination of social security, but we are not defending this. So I think, I mean, you have to take that in mind when we define the better regulation. That what we're doing is organize a reflection, organize the evidence, and bring support for politicians to make a choice on the basis of a number of overarching priorities which have been defined by the politicians. And, I mean, just also to give another example, if you come back to the example of the carbon price, I mean, the carbon price, okay, there was an agreement on global warming. There was an agreement there to operationalize this with CO2 reduction targets, energy efficiency, renewables targets. In that framework, the carbon price plays a role for only a subset of this. So there was never an intention to say that the carbon price was an internalization of all the aspects of carbon. No, the carbon price has been passed by the politicians limited to fixing the price of carbon for the part of the manufacturing sector, including the power sector, to reduce, to deliver a certain amount of reduction of CO2 emissions. So that's what you do, yeah? So that's, again, we haven't been asked in the Commission to decide how you internalize all costs. We've been given that instruction from the political choice. And you have to always go back to this hierarchy of values and decisions and political agenda. So then to come back on the issue of what what you were criticizing on the impact assessment is that, I mean, the impact assessment is not a representation of values. It is a representation on how you use basic tools to organize, to present the possible different combinations of policies. So let's come back to, for instance, to what is written there on the equity, which is in case the efficient outcome is not satisfactory. Or what is the efficient outcome in the sense of better regulation? It's not the efficiency of the market. It's efficient in the sense of better regulation. What is efficient? Is you have an objective, and efficient is the cheapest way or the most efficient way of reaching that objective. It has nothing to do with the fact you're supporting a market process. So if your objective is, I don't know, for instance, financial stability, and you have different ways of calibrating your financial regulation, and at some stage you realize it has some social disadvantage, then you have to correct it. But what you take is your overall objective, which is a political one, and you look at your different ways of achieving that objective, and you look if it has consequences on the distribution. But there's no reference to the efficient functioning of the economy. So I think it's a misunderstanding, and we should...
No, in this case it's miswritten because at the same time... In the first point about market failure, okay, very classical in microeconomics, no problem. There are a lot of problems if you want to internalize the externalities through private mechanisms, okay? If you decide that it's the responsibility of the public body to take into account some externalities, especially social externalities I explained, there is no problem. But at the same time, in the same text, you have efficiency. The first one, I was a professor in economics. Okay, it's very classical for me. It's a kind of reflex, okay? But I continue to read. The third point is about equity. I don't change the meaning of the word. I continue because when I look at the text is really based on the idea, the market, because it's the responsibility of the treaty and so on and so on. I agree with you. But at the same time, you use the same. It's not misunderstanding from me. It's miswritten. You cannot use the same word with two different meanings. I am a citizen. I am not a professor in economics. I am a citizen. And I read the text on something. If I agree with you, I have to very well know the internal mechanism of the European Commission.
The point it made. But I give the floor back to Anne,
okay,
and then back to Stefan.
No, I think,
you had something else
yeah,
to
I think, no, I'm not adding anything. I just want to highlight that the whole construction of the value system and objectives is not part of the better regulation. It is a whole framework which comes from the treaty and a number of political objectives. Some of them are international. And the better regulation is a way to help the decision by illustrating the various trade-offs within that system.
Okay, can you shut down your
mic? Sorry.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Clive, for your comments. I like them very much, but I think this is what you mentioned, optimizing under constraint. This is an issue, and I think where I think we are clear that the economic system is not the best there. But I think what we have to think about this is how do we want to achieve what you mentioned there, then, Mr. Chair, is more politically agreed targets in a way that's that you can keep this in mind, the constraints, and the constraints is the political reality, in my opinion. And therefore, you have to think about this, what can you do there? And one thing is certainly then taxes, and I'm not a supporter of internalizing everything, because there is clearly that you can't monetize this, what we have had with Mercury and so on. But I think it's an approach to achieve, to go to a way forward. And in the constraints of the current problems with the market. Okay, the financial market is also not optimal, what we heard. And I think this, what we have heard earlier this afternoon, is economics is not maximizing GDP more much. Is what we saw is managing scarce resources there and also. And scarce resources, okay, it can be again discussed what is scarcity, but I think it's more how to get to move this the economy in a better state.
Yeah. I just will precise one thing. When I meant optimizing under constraints, to me these constraints can be natural, so posed by the laws of nature, and this we cannot escape, or ethical, but not political expediency, because I'm not sure that I agree with what you say. Well, whatever is politically expedient creates a constraint. No, to me the constraints are set by the treaties, and there, and I will disagree with what you say, because Article 2 of the Treaty on the European Union gives all the values, and the first value is human dignity. It's 2 words. But it's human dignity. So I guess that this is the topmost objective. And it's not the human dignity on average of the population, it's the human dignity of everyone. Well, that's the way I read it. And that creates a constraint. It creates a constraint. So you cannot, again, thou shalt not kill. That's, of course, the most extreme version of negating human dignity, but several levels of grey. Anyway, back to the if you do it in 30 seconds, yes, because I really want to give the floor the chance to come in.
Seconds, all right. So basically what I would say is if you're talking about managing resources and you're saying that the economy is good at managing scarce resources, I think this is wrong. And that's my point. Okay, but the economy does not manage resources, scarce resources, and it's not efficient in the way the economists are telling us. That was basically my point. And then on the other speaker, I would say that, that when you're using any type of tools, your tools are going to be very specific and they actually influence the outcome. So whether you use impact assessment or cost benefit or whatever, you're going to end up with a different way of appraising something and get a different approach. And also that you cannot avoid the values because whatever evaluative tool you use, you end up closing a decision down in a very particular way. And what you close down is very important. The alternatives that are excluded for you to be able to do your impact assessment, the way that you characterize things, shuts down options. And what is the concern of a lot of people who are in the post-growth, degrowth community is that their concerns and their alternatives are excluded even from consideration by the tools that are being used in the Commission and elsewhere.
Okay. Alors, where do we begin? Okay, I will try to take every one of you, but I notice one thing, it's mostly men, and I just want to mention to women that they have the same right to get into the debate. No, because I noticed that this morning and I don't like it. I really want to have a balanced approach. So I'll start with a woman, the lady there. Voila.
Thank you. I think it's working, yeah. Well, my name is Estela. I'm from Spain. I'm a professor in the University Comillas Pontificio. I'm totally confused because I think that we just manage so many concepts and at the same time we don't concrete because I'm a lawyer as well. So for me, it's kind of like we try to defend something that we know deep inside that is not defendable. That's something. Because sometimes we talk about environmental, then morality, then we jump to human rights, and values. So I think we mix all these things and then CEO, for example, to reduction the CO emissions. But at the same time, we don't talk about, for example, what is the price of human rights? For example, we say, no, we can cost, what is the cost of the reduction of CO emissions, the CO2 emissions? What is the cost of, for example, the social cost? We don't say anything about that, the value, how internalize those values, and also we just I don't know, I don't think that people want to focus on that. So most of you guys talk about environmental, the CO2 emissions, but no other environmental also cost. But also for me, because my line of research is animal rights, nobody talks about farms, animals. For example, what is the cost? What is the ethical cost of that? The suffering. What is the price of animal suffering? Is any price? Are you thinking about that? Are you considering those ethical issues in the equation, or they are just nowhere? So we talk about species, for example, but in the environmental. But what about the other animals? Are we just considering them? Are they in social equation, environmental, or they are anywhere? So thank you.
Thank you. Rules of the game. What I propose is this. We started a quarter late, we'll end a quarter late, so at 6:15 at the latest. I suggest that we will take a round of questions and one round of answers, and that's going to be it. Because if we do too many to's and fro's, and the risk is that, well, not everyone gets to speak. So try to be concise in your questions so we can take as many of them as possible. So, Mr. in the blue shirt.
Thank you. I have a short remark and one question. The remark is that also social servants have something like an ethical responsibility. So sometimes they have to confront politicians with facts. That's one. My question to Mr. Speck and Mrs. Bucher. Do you know the 3 reports about climate deaths? There were 3 in a row, and the last one gave the following figures. The Climate Vulnerability Monitor from DARA in Madrid listed 400,000 climate deaths per year, mainly around the tropical area. It's our responsibility as well. And they also, for the first time in the 3rd report, figured out how many people are dying because of the fossil fuels. They came to 4.7 million killed by fossil fuels. A very extra reason to hurry on. And it was Professor Pimentel in the United States. He calculated $1,000 for 1 people getting ill or dead. Thank you.
Okay, next lady. Aha. Aha. Where are they? No ladies. So, sorry, you were right in my bullseye and I didn't see you.
Ja, dat was een vraag of ze het kennen, of ze het rapport kennen.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I just have a short question that just came to my mind. To me, this has remained very Eurocentric so far, the sessions I have attended at least. And I would like to maybe build on what you said, what you just said. I'm wondering if the subject of environmental justice and the depth that you just mentioned, is it also on the agenda? And yeah, what are your reflections on this?
Sir? You.
Okay, thank you. I just have a slight historical point because I think it's important to understand where concepts such as polluter pay arose from, and more specifically, whose interests they served. And so, although it seems like kind of a progressive idea that, if you pollute, the polluter has to pay historically, and here I'm drawing from the work by his environmental historian Jean-Baptiste Fressoz, who showed that actually in the 18th century, the polluter pay principle was adopted and principally pushed by industrialists, because at the time the dominant ethos was that pollution shouldn't be happening at all, and when you had new industries arising, there was a big popular backlash that these simply shouldn't be happening, and so the strategy adopted by industrialists was to say, well, if you allow us to open the factory, then we'll create compensation schemes, and that'll solve the sort of antagonism that arose from the pollution. So I think it's really important to keep that history in mind when we use those tools, as we say, because it can often be used as a discursive strategy to shift conversation away from those central questions we were talking about of what are the constraints, so what are the productive processes that shouldn't be permissible at all. And so I guess to lead that to a question, I would just be curious to know, because I'm unfamiliar with the EU parliamentary process, where within the political process those conversations can take place, of which forms of productive processes should not be permissible. Thank you.
Thank you. Another lady? Yeah, there.
Hello, I'm a sustainability student from Maastricht University, and today we talked about externalities as if it's a kind of new thing, so we didn't go too much into detail, but it was around for decades, at least since the Club of Rome. And we know when there is political will, things can go fast, for example, with ozone layer. And with CO2 emissions, we don't see this happening, with plastic pollution, with biodiversity loss, and many other issues. So do you think this is because we cannot really put a price, or we cannot define some things like values and so on, or life of animals? Or is it because there is no political will to do so? So is it because of you cannot quantify it, or because there is no will to do so?
As I'm the only politician on the panel, I will answer at the end. Up to you. Yeah. Now.
Thank you. I'm from the European Commission. A question to Mr. Spash and Mr. Lambert on how far you can take the dignity concept. People live cannot have a price. Do you take part in traffic? How quickly do you want to be somewhere? Which risk did you take? Are you driving because you want to become a more virtuous driver, or you want to drive maximizing the rule that if everyone drives as you would drive, this would be an ethical rule? Or do you accept that you take certain risks and trade-offs? This question is a bit focused on Mr. Spash. I'm curious of his answer.
Good question. Another lady? Did I see? Yeah, there you are.
I just wanted to, based on this interesting, or how you say, contrasting discussion from the panel, I just wanted to point out to the irony, or the fact that how as economists, like, we are so always so confident about quantifying this optimum level of outcome, production, but then also at the same time, isn't it like even optimum level of extension? But then it's also funny that we have failed to identify optimum level of our, as humans, how much, like, what should be our population size, or even what should be our economic size, because now we are at the point where our, like, in terms of impact assessment, if we look at and try to assess the impact of our whole economic activity or the history of last 200 years, we are on the verge where we are creating this collapse for ourselves. So I just wanted to point out that we have somehow failed to identify our optimum level of existence. That's it.
Yeah, Mr. in the black shirt.
Hello, so I'm François Schneider. So we wrote a book like about housing for the growth with Andy Tranelson. I want to say that about this idea of natural market, I don't think that after the tax or before the tax, it's more natural, you know. So I find a shame that, as it was said, that for many years it was discussed this to put a tax on eco tax on these kind of things, but people continue favoring planes on trains, and it would be changed if there would be a kerosene tax. And about housing, which is an important issue, is like, a lot could be done with taxing empty flats, large flats, the non-shared flats, new flats instead of renovation, land destruction, on what, in my opinion, is very important is how the taxes are decided, who sits around the table, are we all on the equal basis, and also who manages the money from the tax, because it could be used really to favor more frugality in housing. On many things could be possible. Also, even it can be actually organized at the local level, even between friends. I think there's lots of possibilities. It's never natural anyway. It's something constructed by us. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
No lady, then we end up. Voilà, there's one. Yeah.
Hello, Séverine Robert, PhD student at the Queen's University of Belfast. So I feel that there is one actor that's been missing from the discussion. And if we take the example of animal rights, and let's take the meat business, for example, we see that companies create products, so meat in question, and they have a high politic impact. And then these costs end up on society, and it's the government who has to deal with them. And we see the same thing in the textile industry, for example, and we see the same thing with plastic. So when are we actually going to hold our companies accountable for what they're doing? And we know that lobbying is a big thing in politics, and I think it's a big thing in the European Union as well. So when are we going to make efficient action to counteract these side effects that we call externalities, but actually we know that they are from the actions of these companies. So what do you politicians do against this? Thank you.
Now, just, I'm keeping an eye on the time. What I will do is at 5:26, I will stop taking questions, because I want to give 5 minutes to each of our speakers to answer, and that leads us to 6:15. So I'll take a few more questions. So, Mr. Dare, in, well, yellow shirt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Olaf Meyer-Rühle. I'm a Brussels-based economist, not yet post-growth economist, but nobody's perfect. I failed to see really the link between the issue of internalization of external costs and the post-growth discussion. I think once we get to the post-growth stage, we will have to scrap most of cost-benefit analysis, CBA, and internalization of external cost debate. But so this would be my question to the panel: where is really the link? But I have a short comment on Mr. Speck's reference to Professor Pigou, 1920, which he told us that it is now traded under the term of corrective taxes. Now, Mr. Pigou, in this 1920 publication, The Economics of Welfare, did deal with the subject of, let's say in modern terms, congestion charging and infrastructure charging, but it has nothing to do really with internalization of external costs. The argument of Pigou was really that those corrective measures and schemes to divert excess of demand to another time of the day, to use a motorway, for example, that this should be fiscally neutral. No way to raise taxes and to pay for other things. So what the ones have to pay, this has to be distributed to others, and this is the fiscal neutrality principle. He made it very clear in a later edition of this work, but nobody seems to have read this later version where he explained it. Okay, I just leave it to this comment. I think the efficiency problem is maybe a linkage, but I think also this we have, as you mentioned it, we have to reconsider it under new ideas.
Okay. Thomas Arnold from DG Research and Innovation. There's been some recent research work from Leeds University on a safe and just operating space for humanity, which takes in the planetary boundaries concept from Rockström, like climate, biodiversity, phosphorus, nitrogen, circles, and also the social foundations, like food and education and income and so on, and tries to assess if countries are evolving within this safe and just operating space, resulting in the conclusion that for the time being, not a single country, you may have seen the chart, a very appealing visual, not a single country is within this safe and just operating space for humanity. So it's a big challenge to get us all there. Now I come to my question. Could this not be kind of a model for impact assessment for public policies, that we ask to what extent can a policy or can policies move within this space where you contribute at the same time to the social foundations, the multiple social foundations and evolve within the planetary boundaries and find a way to combine those multiple targets and have not an approach based on a small number of single indicators, but try and integrate as many as possible.
Thank you. Yes, Miss, I'm just looking. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Noé Lecoq from Inter-Environnement Wallonie. I come back to the carbon pricing debate, not only for industry, but for all sectors. If we fully acknowledge that carbon pricing is not the tool for that leads to the most efficient reduction in emissions, and that we fully acknowledge that the market is not perfectly efficient, and if we also fully acknowledge that carbon pricing can lead to dangerous side effects, like putting the charge of emission reduction mainly on people that are that have low economic solvability, on the poor, should we completely abandon carbon pricing, or could we, knowing these limits, use carbon pricing, increase taxes nevertheless on oil, gas and coal, to raise revenues, to finance the low carbon transition, and to finance compensatory measure for social welfare? Should we say it's black or white, or is it a kind of pragmatic approach that doesn't say it is the perfect solution, it's one tool that has to be used with other more regulatory kind of policies?
Thank you, and this will be the last one. Yeah.
Aljosha Slamershak from Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. I don't want to go into externalities as a concept, but I think that when we're doing impact assessment, European Union, its framework is missing on one really important thing, which is international trade relations. Because when we have impact assessments and we only apply them to domestically produce goods, to domestically produce flows of energy and materials, we forget that we are really dependent also on the flows and produce that we export or import to other countries. And if we don't apply the same kind of standards to those other countries, then we allow for huge ecological degradations and abhorrent social conditions that are created in the production of those goods and materials. So I think the first thing that the European Commission really has to think about when they want to reevaluate the impact assessment is how they're going to introduce it also to the trade agreements. And with our approach to trade agreements, which is just to create more free markets, it's definitely not leading in a way where the products and ecological waste that is traded with other countries, other areas of the world, is not subjected to any kind of basic criteria that we, on the other hand, within the European Union, so proudly say that we are increasing the standards of.
Thank you. Back to our speakers, and sorry for those of you who couldn't speak, but well, we are time limited. That's one of the limits. So I'll take the speakers in the same order. So 5 minutes each. I will not shy away from the challenges that were addressed to me, so I'll say a few words at the end, but Anna, you first.
Okay, it's going to be short because I think most of the questions and comments, they refer to the way we define our big policies and objectives, and I think that's more for the chair to answer these points. So I will not. I mean, I might just give a couple of specific points more related to the way we use the impact assessment and we look at this internalization of external costs. First thing which you need to have in mind is that an impact assessment is there to look at the different policy options to reach an objective. Yeah? So it is to compare different types of policies to reach an objective which has been fixed politically. And that is where we look at this issue of efficiency. If the way we have the evidence and we look at what the policy cost and benefits is not taking all the necessary values or is not quantifying everything, we look at this in a quantitative way to signal to the policymakers, listen, you might go for this option, but it has an impact on fundamental rights. It's not quantified, it's not internalized, but your job to see whether you can really go ahead with that. And that's what an impact assessment does. So we are not having a model. We are trying to put the evidence and to organize it and signal the issues which are important for the policymakers to have in mind when they take the decision. The second element, and I'm not going to go much more in detail, but the second element which you have in mind is that whatever evidence we take and calculations we do, cost-benefit modelling or whatever, the second pillar of evidence of an impact assessment, and you mentioned it, is the consultations. And the consultations, and what we do in the, so consultations are compulsory, open public consultations are compulsory, 12 weeks, all languages. And you've seen the recent one on the summertime, 4.6 million responses on the summertime. And consultations, targeted consultations, and we look at to what extent the policy options which are on the table correspond to what the consultations tell us is important. We look at it whether it's a real problem for the citizens, whether they have views on the policy options, whether they have views on the impacts they don't want to see. So you have to keep that in mind, that it's an exercise which has that dimension. And I really insist on this because sometimes people tend to forget that it is really in an interactive process.
Thanks for the questions. I hope I can address many of them. Okay, I think about the animal rights issues. We have to think this is for me more a regulatory approach what we need there. There is certainly nothing about what I present here was more about market-based instruments. This we should keep in mind. And internalizing externalities is certainly a tool for achieve a policy objective and in particular to changing behavior, our behavior in this direction. This direction, what you mentioned about climate vulnerability of 400,000 deaths. Yes, we have to change our behavior that we are, and also behavior of the industries, that we are going more to renewables there. And one tool is certainly to make non-renewable energies more expensive. Renewable, yeah. The other thing about the ozone layer, why we were there successful, I think there is an issue about substitution possibilities. It was not too difficult to have a substitution between ozone layer and other chemicals there. Therefore, we achieved there quite, in a fast period of time, some positive results. It's certainly not so easy in other environmental areas like carbon pricing. Internalizing external costs, the PIGU, these corrective taxes is not my idea that I use this phrase. This is what you find in academic literature. More and more. This is the wording what I use there. Corrective measures for excess demands, yes, we have this issue about and fiscal neutrality, and there I want to come to the other question about carbon pricing debate. What we are doing there, that we are charging there probably also maybe the equity issue, poorer people more there. There is certainly the whole discussion about carbon pricing and carbon taxes, and EU ETS is more to use the revenues for policies for investment into renewables, but also to think about this using revenues for supporting the poorer part of the society. And there are examples from Europe and from other countries under the heading of ecological tax reform. This is an issue since the 1990s. That is really thought about fiscal neutrality, that you're using the taxes or the revenues generated by environmental taxes for other policy fields. I think the last question about footprint, international trade, is quite interesting, and I'm looking forward to hear your comments there, because I think we have to be there careful. What can European policies doing, European policymakers or national policymakers? Okay, the issue about from DG RDT colleague there about was this direction of donut economy, only for my information there, what you mentioned.
That's the donut economy,
okay.
Which integrates the planetary boundaries
and
the social foundations. And you have the economy thriving in this intermediate circle between the two layers.
Okay, but there is also, but probably you will not be happy about, you have to think about trade-offs there.
Is it trade-offs? Can it be done without trade-offs? Can you define the space in such a way that you realize both?
But this would be the best. This would.
I can give you the reference on the.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, Clive.
On the animal issue, well, one of the things there is which ethical basis you're going to address the issue, right? So there's a big issue in animal, is it welfare? Do they have rights? Are you concerned about the actual animals themselves and living a good life? I mean, these are the different ethical approaches. So it actually relates to what I was saying about the ethical basis that you use. And you end up with very different outcomes, especially in policy. If you go down a welfare basis, you still have battery farming with chickens in awful conditions because they're supposed to be living okay under the welfare criteria. They're not suffering. But is it a meaningful life to have a chicken that has no feathers in a cage and quite often has no legs either? This is not particularly a good life for the chicken. In terms of the debate being ecocentric, well, I guess we're in the European Parliament, so it's probably ecocentric. But there is a big issue, of course, around this. I mean, if we're talking about climate change or we're talking about trade, which was talked about earlier in one of the earlier sessions, you've got a massive issue about the way we have an interlinked world today. So, there are deaths, there's exploitation, there's offshoring going on, German economy trying to appear that it's green and clean by offshoring production to China and pushing things out, the Norwegians selling oil and armaments to other countries, and yet they come across as being a great nation because they give a Nobel Peace Prize and these kinds of things. So there's clearly a lot of issues around the extent to which the Europeans try to appear superior and clean and green and ethical when they're not. And that's part of the systemic problem that we have, I think. Driving, okay, so the question about driving. Well, actually, I don't have a car. I gave it up because it's environmentally and politically dangerous thing to have, right? So I actually ride a bicycle. But if you want to start going into this, how do you make decisions about trade-offs and risks and how do you evaluate stuff, I think it's a problem with the way that you're conceptualizing what you do as a human being. So economists are trained to think that everything is a trade-off, right? But it's an impossible approach. So what's the trade-off of you being here right now? You could be anywhere. You could be anywhere in the world. You could be living a different life. You could be wearing a different set of clothes. You could have a sex change. Whatever. I mean, what are the trade-offs? It's an impossible question. So you bound the question in the first place in order to start it, to even start discussing what the trade-offs are. And this was my point earlier about the tools that you use and the way that you phrase things. And it's not about that. What you do is you make judgments. I think it's much better to think about making judgments and actually thinking about we have to make judgments, not trade-offs. So, do you go to your dying mother's bedside or not, or do you go to the European Parliament for your job today? Is this a trade-off? No, it's a judgment that you have, and it's a value conflict that you face. And it's a fundamentally different thing to phrase it that way and to think of it in those terms. And I think that's much more meaningful. About the markets, and this came up, I think, twice, carbon pricing and taxes, and then how these use. I think it comes through basically in what Francois was saying as well. Any regulatory instrument you use, there is no superior instrument, right? So it doesn't matter if you have emissions trading, taxes, direct regulation, whatever. You're relating to a set of institutions and political powers. And you have to design it in that context, and you have to be aware of the context in which you're designing it. Now, some of the instruments play to the market, and they play to powerful players in the market, which is why emissions trading is an awful scheme, because it plays directly to the banking and finance sector, the speculators, and the corporations. And it's highly problematic, and it's been a total failure. Yes, it's been a total failure. And if you look at the basics, there's been no emissions reductions, and there's been fraud all over the place, and the big corporations have made a lot of money out of it. So you have to think about, when you do regulation, what the impacts are on the different players and what system it is that you're using. So there's a lot of issues, and it's not just like putting a tax in and it affects people who don't have any money because we have inequity in society. It's across the board. It's with any regulatory approach. How is it designed is very important, which is why you can't generically talk, as mainstream economists do, about taxes or versus emissions trading with actually no institutional design going on in that approach. So what do we else have? Yeah, okay, so externalities, and then why are they relevant in post-growth? Wouldn't post-growth or degrowth, or would it be a totally different society? I think the issue there is how we're conceptualizing externalities in the first place. So what I argued was that externalities is a misnomer. It's a misconceptualization. They're not external to the system, they're part of the system. Now, would you have no externalities in a degrowth or post-growth society? No, you wouldn't, because you're still going to be living on planet Earth and you're still going to have material and energy throughput. So you're going to have impacts. And the thing is then to think about it not in terms of externalities, they're part of the system, they're a natural part of our human system, but actually what type of shifting of costs we end up with. Who ends up having the costs shifted onto them, and how is that dealt with ethically in society? Because what we currently have is we have cost shifting done on the basis that it's efficient and done by corporations. So they shift the costs onto other people and then claim, look, our products are cheap because we exploit labor in third world countries and dump pollution there. Right? And this is the point that was made earlier by Christian Felber as well, I think, that this is highly problematic in this competitive economy, that efficiency is actually cost shifting. It's cost shifting onto others. You will have the same issues in a degrowth society, and you would deal with them in a different way, in a more ethical way, one would hope. Right? So I think that's all those things. I just want a couple of things at the end came up, which is the ozone layer, right? The ozone layer, actually, I don't think it was solved, and it wasn't such a great thing in the end, because what happened is the corporations shifted to producing other chemicals, which have other impacts, and also some of them destroy the ozone layer. So, and they also offshored production into third world countries, so they didn't get regulated like India and so on. And then you ended up with various disasters like the Bhopal disaster. And the donut economics, I think is superficial and unscientific. It's a way to sell something to the public. It has a nice little diagram, but the hole in the middle is bigger than the content.
Thank you. Denis.
I come back about equity. It was more or less the first question or something like that about the complexity of the concepts or and so on and so on and so on. I repeat, in the impact assessment, there is no trade-off between any economic concern on human rights. The absolutely human rights, they have the priority over any economic calculus. It's very, very clear. And about the problem of equity or equality is very strange, because you have a very, in EU institution, you have the equality, the gender equality. And why do we have the gender equality? We need to come back to the Treaty of Roma. In the Treaty of Roma, equality between women and men was justified by the competitive market. On the competitive market, women, they must receive the same wage as men. And from a historical point of view, it's to give you some example of some ideas between the competitive market and the notion of equity, of equality. In fact, the gender balance between men and women is coming from the idea of the competitive market within the Treaty of Roma, but only on one variable, the salary. And so today, after decades and decades and decades, there has been a lot of discussion on directives about the working conditions of men and women. And today, you have, I don't remember, the revision of the parental leave, in which the Commission has made a proposal. The proposal has been refused by the companies, the European companies, Business Europe, and also in the Parliament. I think there is a lot of opposition against the parental leave, the revision of the parental leave directive. And so there is some areas in which not the Commission, but the other actors or the other EU institutions, they can discuss and they can build some kind of equity. I give you another example. In 2000, perhaps I am wrong, but I think it was in 2000, two directives have been published on against the discrimination in employment and discrimination in citizenship. The race, the religion, and so on, and so on, and so on. And I think that, I am not sure, the directive on the discrimination, anti-discrimination in employment was more or less linked to the notion of the economic sphere, the economic area, and the directive on the discrimination on citizenship was more or less linked to the idea of universal human rights. And so is the reason for what? The notion of equity is perhaps ambivalent. It's not always very easy to define. But at the same time, it would be very interesting to have a kind of doctrine, a law doctrine, about the notion of equity in Europe. It is more or less my hope. My second point is totally different. It's about the problem, it's linked about the problem of ecological tax on taxes for the social welfare systems. And I have not a position about this debate. It's a very questionable question. Why? Because in history, the social welfare systems, they have been built on the notion of labor. And the ecological tax has been built on the notion of nature. And so you have two different fields. And when you look at the literature, for instance, Amartya Sen is not in favor of any ecological tax to finance the social welfare systems. And also I remember some years ago, Piketty was not all in favor of a kind of financing of social welfare systems through or by the ecological tax. But I think that in today and in the future, this question will be fundamental at the same time for the nature or for people.
Thank you. So some questions were addressed to me, and I'll start with the question that you asked about human dignity. It's a fair one. I have a car, and I know it's damaging to others. It's quite obvious. I mean, my activities are harmful to the society, but the question is, it's really twofold. One, can we yes, well, if humans did not exist on this planet, the ecological impact of humanity would be zero. And so, do we advocate that? No. We advocate a future for humanity. So we will keep having an impact on this planet. But the question is, can our impact be such that we stay in the safe operating environment? And you may say whatever you like about donut economics. I'm just saying that there's a safe operating environment, both socially and environmentally, that we need to stay inside. Now, the boundaries are not known with precision. This is what we know that we don't know everything, but we know that there's limits beyond which, the operating environment may be safe for mice, but not for human beings. That's what I meant earlier when I spoke about climate. So climate can become so bad that we couldn't survive, but other living organisms could survive. There's living organisms on planets where we could not possibly live. So yes, it is about, you might say almost damage control, but limits to what we can impose to this planet and to future generations. And when I say this planet, it's including other life forms than ours. And yes, there's stuff that we can afford to do, and there's stuff that we cannot afford to do. And it's always a political judgment. And back to what one person asked, when will politicians basically have the courage to do the right thing? I'll just give you my honest answer, because it's a question I'm getting all the time. Because yes, as I said earlier, the decisions that we take. I mean, it's politicians voting in the Council, in the Parliament. And no one is holding my hand when I push the button. I can tell you that. No one. So the first good news is that lobbying exists. I say that because the fact that companies are spending zillions of euros to lobby us means that we have the power. If we didn't, they wouldn't lobby us. So that's good news. That means that if there is political will, and that was implicit in your question, if there is the will, there's a way. Lenin said that, but actually democracy says that. We still can rule, and that's good news. And especially, I would say, at European level, and this is why I want to play here and not at national level, because the leverage that we have here is immense. Leveraging, again, and some might hate me for saying that, but the biggest leverage we have versus the multinationals is our market. Access to our market, one of the biggest on the planet. This is the weapon that we need to wield. Because yes, we will, as long as there are human beings, we will live material lives, and that means indeed products and services that we are going to use to live our lives. And that means that there is a market. The market should not be all, but a market exists, and some people want to serve that market, and that's a powerful leverage. Now, why is the will sometimes lacking? You might say politicians are corrupt. There are corrupt politicians. I do not buy the idea that the vast majority of politicians are corrupt. I mean, accepting money, bribes, to do stuff that is harmful. Some politicians are like that, yes, but this does not explain the majority voting for stuff that you and I sometimes perceive as harmful decisions. Car emission standards before we got to where we are today. So it cannot be corruption. There can be conflicts of interest, and there's too much of that. And again, Olivier Derwin, who is the mastermind of this event, and I will thank him again tomorrow, cannot earn a euro cent from doing anything else than what he does for me, because he's employed full-time by the European Parliament to serve me as a member of Parliament. Me, I can earn as much as I want, as long as I declare a bracket of my income. Is this fair? No. Is this a conflict of interest? Yes. And that again explains part of the problem. And there's other more hidden forms of conflicts of interest, but they exist. Do conflicts of interest also touch civil servants? I would say potentially yes, but again, the key problem is with elected policymakers. If you have to start someplace in curbing conflicts of interest, start there. Because ultimately, Anne does not vote. Anne provides guidance, advice, data, and I may like the data or not, but she does not get the decision at the end. I get it, this role. So if you want to shoot at someone, that's me. But to me, the most profound problem, and why did we change on ozone layer? Yes, you said it, there was a substitution, and actually it's the same businesses that had to win from the transition that those that had to lose from the transition away from CFC. So that was an easy one. Now, if we talk about the transition that we need to take, yes, some will lose. That's destructive creation, but actually many self-professed liberals hate destructive creations. They want it for others, but not for themselves. Case in point, the European car industry says, let us pollute more, because otherwise we will need to scrap jobs. Actually, they're not interested in jobs, they're interested in profits. And so, yes, there will be losers in the transitions. There will be winners as well, but there will be losers. But the most difficult thing is that technology is not enough. What we mean, and back to your question, it's changing the way we live. And you know what? I don't like to change. I'm a green. I hate changing. I told the story to many, so maybe you've heard it already. When I was elected 9 years ago, I had to surrender my company car. In Belgium, it's a social scandal, a fiscal scandal, an environmental scandal. So me, the green, I should have been happy handing over the keys of my corporate car. I hated it. because it's so convenient. And that is what makes it difficult. So yes, we need to find the courage as politicians, but there we have to have civil servants speaking truth to power, and I'd like to see more of that, to basically face us with the consequences of our choices, if we are tasked with making the choices. But also, we have to get out of a thinking pattern. And this is where I liked what you said, is that yes, we may tend to be prisoners of one way of looking at reality. And in this utilitarianism, this utility function that Homo economicus wants to maximize, actually there's more to life than that. But that is a bit the point I was making to one of the universities I welcomed here last Friday, is that teaching in economics is dominated by this strand of economics. And it's not just the economists should be free, should be freed from that way of thinking. It's us all. Us all. Because, well, when I minored in economy, that's what I was taught. And that's a process. And this is where it really gets difficult, because freeing ourselves of one way of looking at things is difficult. And this is the meaning, and I'll finish with that, is the meaning of this event. This is the meaning of this event. It is not people lecturing other people. It's trying to reflect together on how we can find ways to mobilize this very powerful instrument, because it is powerful, believe me, that is called the European Union, before it's too late, so that we engage into this transition. And again, and I will say that for the Commission, that, well, I've had many disputes with people in the Commission, but I really find a renewed appetite for revisiting the way we do things in the Commission. And I'm struck by that. And this is why, again, this event is happening now. Because I see an appetite to say, okay, well, we see the problem of inequality. We see the problem of ecological footprint. And we see that the recipes that we're using are not really cracking the code. There's an appetite for reopening those doors and trying to find solutions. So this is what we try to achieve. But again, I'm not perfect. I cannot lecture any of you as to what should be done, what should not be done. But we are, yes, prisoners of what we have been doing the last 30, 50, 100 years. And, you know, I'm a reformist. I'm not a revolutionary. I do believe that if you want to renverser la table, as we say in French, to dump whatever we did in the past, the end result will be worse than trying to reform. So yes, we need to be radical, but we need to be reformist, and that's what we try to invent. I stopped for today.